Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, daily dose of nature. Today's topic, how to get the very best nature photos, presented by Nat Hab Expedition Leader, Richard Gouveia. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you everyone for tuning in this evening or this afternoon for you guys. I have my little cup of peppermint tea here tonight, and each night from now on when we do the webinars, I'm going to experiment with a new type of tea, so you'll see whether my face changes or not. Tonight we're going to talk about camera setup, and I'm obviously an expedition leader with Nat Hab and have been with Nat Hab for a number of years. Love all their trips and all the spaces, and we are getting into season. I'm very excited to start my first trip next month. But in order to be prepared for any of these trips, we have to be prepared in our setup of our cameras. So today I'm going to dedicate my time to teaching you about how I set up my camera, and hopefully to help you get to a point where your camera is in the right position or the right setup, at least, to be able to capture the amazing moments that you will see on any wildlife trip that you go on with Natural Habitat. Now, there was a guest that once put forward the 7 Ps to me. For the sake of keeping this PG, we're going to change it to the 6 Ps, which is proper prior planning prevents poor performance. There is a word that goes between prevents and poor with a P. If you want to sit with a dictionary and figure out what that word is, you can, or check. I definitely dropped that one in one of my previous webinars and felt a little bit uneasy at my language, so I pulled back from that. So this proper prior planning is vitally important, and the reason why it's so important when it comes to wildlife photography is the simple fact that our subjects do not listen to us. I cannot say to the bird, stay there, or I can, but it's not going to listen. I can't tell a lion, listen, won't you go sit up on the top? No, turn to me and lift your nose and, oh yes, smile, look good. You can't do that with wildlife. We have to be in a ready mode that we can capture the moment as it's about to happen. One of the greatest strengths that I've found within wildlife photography is actually understanding animal behavior, and that's why going on a trip with someone like Nat Hab, who's going to put the very best guide with you for a photographic trip, is going to give you the opportunity to be ready for that moment. But beyond being ready to push the trigger and push the shutter button and take the image, it's about having all your settings in the right place so that you get the best focus you can, that the light and color is right, that your images are in the right quality, that you have opportunities for video mode, that you have enough light to be able to freeze action by using ISO, and all of these little bits and pieces. So I previously created a video for my own channels with the setup of my Sony Alpha A1. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that as a backdrop, and then I've dropped in different bits and pieces for Nikon and Canon users, and this will extend over to Fuji and Olympus. And in little parts, I've also included the GoPro, because there are some video stuff where I promised in one of my Galapagos and 2 of my Galapagos things that I would teach you a little bit about the GoPro setup and what each thing means. Now, for the most part, the terminology remains the same no matter what we do as we go through this. What is only going to change is where it is in your menu. So it might take you a bit of time. This whole presentation will be on YouTube afterwards, and you'll be shared a link to this so you can re-watch it if you need to be able to pinpoint those specific words. And then where I'm going to start is with focus, and specifically focus area. The reason being is focus is beyond our composition and beyond freezing action, which I've stressed in many of my previous talks. Focus is the one thing that can make or break an image, 100%. A bad composition can be fixed. A wrong shutter speed can sometimes look good. An out of focus photograph is just plain out of focus. As again, there's no such thing as a good or a bad photograph, merely your interpretation of it. But unless your intention was to not have it in focus, that becomes a big problem. So we're going to start with focus area. I'll play this video through and we'll talk a little bit more through that.
What's up, guys? I'm Richard de Gouveia, and I would like to run through my top 10 settings for my A1 in setting it up for success for wildlife photography. I believe that setting up your camera and getting the basics right is key to capturing the incredible moments out there in the field. There's certain things that people will do and everyone will do differently. I'm going to run through a few of them and tell you what I do and how I do it. Focus area, there are many different ones here. These are the 4 major ones that I use. I've turned the others off. I use wide focus, which basically looks at the entire area of the image. I look at the tracking or zonal areas, which then allow me to put different blocks in different places. We can go in there again and have a medium spot or a small spot. Those are the 2 I choose. There is our tracking spot. Now, tracking I have set into the same idea. Tracking wide, tracking zone, tracking spot, and tracking medium. And this allows me, when focused, once it's locked on, it will then hold those areas and allow me to do and follow and recompose as needed to create the images that I need.
All right, so the reason why I started with focus area, and here's an example of what it looks like on Canon, and we'll look at this as a backdrop. How many of you have taken a photograph of some form of wildlife, be it a bird, a lion, a bear, and you get back and you look at your computer and there's this incredibly sharp photo of a piece of grass in front of a bear or a lion or whatever's behind it. So often this happens because we have left our autofocus selection to auto. So what it does is the camera tries to figure out where you're focusing, and focus is a judgment of distance. It's basically telling the camera or the lens that the object you're focusing on is 10 yards away, 20 yards away, 10.5 yards away, so that that glass can focus correctly, so that the light hits the sensor at the perfect space. The problem comes in is that if it's guessing, it's going to go to the first object in front of it, which may be a piece of grass, it may be a branch of a tree of some sorts that then gets in the way. So by choosing our manual selection of our points, either a single point in the middle, and depending on the level of your camera, and this doesn't mean go out and buy the most expensive camera, but my first camera I remember had 7 points on it. It literally had 7 dots that I had to choose the different focus points from. 1 in the middle, 2 up top, 2 to the sides, 2 at the bottom, 2 to the left. That was it. And now my camera has 693 spots to choose from. So we've moved a little bit in that direction, which allows us to move to specific points to relocate and to recompose our images. What we can do though is start to group sections where you create bigger things. So in this, there will be a 9-point grouping. So around the center point, you will have 9 blocks that are now looking for any movement. It can then grow to 21 blocks, like here in the Nikon. It talks about 25-point dynamic area and a 72-point dynamic area, all the way up to 153-point dynamic area before going to what I would term on the Sonys as wide. So depending on my subject, I like to keep it in medium and small spots, so keep that area quite small so that I can aim between things and make sure that I get focus on what I want. Then if I'm shooting maybe birds that are a bit bigger, then go to zonal, so it then becomes a bigger area. Or if it's birds in flight across a blue sky, I will go to wide and let it pick the area and move across. So we have to choose the right area mode in order to ensure that our camera is finding the correct point of focus each and every time. Now, one of the new advents of mirrorless photography is the invention of eye autofocus. And eye autofocus is quite simply a game changer. I like to refer to it as cheating, but it's not cheating, because what we're doing is we're creating art. We're not fighting to see who can focus the fastest. So in the old days when we were shooting on film cameras, you had to manually focus something, and those who had the time and the patience to practice that technique got to be professionals. Those who didn't got a lot of out of focus photos. So let's have a listen to this and then we'll chat about it.
Also, the other part of this amazing camera is what are we doing? We can turn our face eye priority focus on and off. I can choose human, animal, or bird as my options, and I have created a shortcut key, C1, which is the thing that will roll through these. You can see from animal to bird to human to animal to bird to human just by pushing the button.
So we can see how much of a difference this would make. And in order to have this functionality, we have to start thinking about new technology. It's where we're going. So here is the Canon back, and they have an opportunity to go to people, animals, or vehicles, or none. So they have an extra option where without the birds in this specific camera. And then our Nikons have our different focus areas like we were talking about earlier: wide, small, wide, large, la 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 la. Then we have our animal eye autofocus and our people eye autofocus. So depending on which camera body you're using, it will give you an option to use this. Now what it does is it effectively takes away our thought process of having to worry about focus, because once it is locked on, I can then have a wider grouping of points pointed in the direction. The software then looks and goes, oh, there's an eye. And the further we get along this, so I was shooting when the first generation of animal eye autofocus came in, and it was good, really good, but not perfect. So I'd go into the gorillas and suddenly it would be focusing on the nostril because it's a round object, looks like an eye, and I would be getting a nostril in focus instead of the eye, which is a good 2 inches back from the nostril, which then loses that feel of the image. So we have to worry about that. Leopard spots. A lot of the Canons have been having issues with leopard spots and just going for the spots because it doesn't know the difference. But as the technology gets better, using the facial recognition software that's been built into these things, it's becoming more and more accurate. The next thing we have to think about is our image quality. So I got this off the internet, a great little breakdown of the difference between RAW and JPEG. Now, I've said this before, but for those who haven't heard it, I like to see RAW or JPEG as packing for a Nat Hab trip. You get your pre-departure briefing book, You open it up to weight restrictions and it says you are only allowed 44 pounds on this trip. Thanks for coming, no more, that's it. So we have to pick and choose what we put in there. We put our shirts, our pants, the right shoes, zip it up. We then lock it because we're going to climb on a plane. And maybe if you're worried about your luggage, you wrap it in cellophane. Don't do that too much because it's wasting plastic, but I'm just putting it out there. And what happens is when you do this, your bag becomes compressed. That is effectively what a JPEG file is. We're telling it we want the file to be this big. We want the white balance, we want the picture control, we want all the light and everything else to be locked into one and compressed to a different size. So effectively a JPEG has 16 million colors within that photograph. The size is smaller. This is on a specific type of camera, and your images, you would get a lot more out of it because the images are smaller. A 14-bit raw photo will give you 68 billion colors. So a huge range more than what your JPEG is. And your file size is much bigger and your image quality is higher, but it takes up more space on the card. The reason why we would want to shoot in RAW is in order to be able to do post-production, in order to go into Lightroom and push and pull images to be able to get the most out of it. Because our camera, no matter how much we have spent on it, is not as good as our human eye. And we are seeing the world far differently to what our camera is. So we need to balance those images after the fact to bring them back to a happy space. So let's watch the video and we'll talk through this a little bit more.
If I go into image quality and go in here, I've set everything up to be shot in RAW. So RAW is my go-to. A lot of people will shoot RAW and JPEG. I find it uses up space. And what I will use is that RAW image will go into Lightroom, which I use for my editing, and then move it through there. Or I'll import it to my phone, edit and push and pull that image.
So the biggest thing we have to remember is that when we're in these things, you have to find your image quality and set it to what you need it to be. In this instance here on the Z6, this guy is shooting in RAW plus fine, which means he's shooting one RAW image and one JPEG image. Like I said in the video, I don't like the idea of RAW plus JPEG. It seems like a waste of space when RAW is already taking up so much space, because I'm not going to do anything with the JPEG folder or photo. Sometimes you may want to send some quick images off home, which is a great way to do that. If your camera's got that functionality, you can get your JPEGs, you can send them off, boom, you're done. But nowadays with the newer cameras, what we're able to do is log on with our phones and send the photos that we want to our phone, and Lightroom will actually process the raw photo, and then you save the JPEG and then send it off. So you're able to make your photos look as good as possible before sending them anywhere. Some people just don't have that will, no problems. But RAW is definitely the way forward for anyone that is willing to learn a bit of post-production. We did a talk about I did a talk about Lightroom and post-production 2 weeks ago, so have a look at that if you haven't seen that. The other thing that's become a massive part of all of our trips is video. And quite funnily enough, I was looking at videos of my childhood that my father very luckily had taken a lot of us when we were from baby all the way up. And to be able to look through those memories is amazing. The one not amazing part about it is there's a lot of crap, because he recorded for hours. I mean, I literally had to go through an entire, I didn't really go through it, I just scrubbed through an entire tennis match that lasted 3 hours. I still am wondering what the hell he was thinking videoing it, but he videoed that. It was a memory, and I'm glad that he did as much because it gave me some stuff. But we need to think about how we're setting up that video and where we're going to go with it. The biggest things we have to think about is our video quality. we always want to try and set it based on how much space you have on the highest setting, because what this does is 1080p or HD as we know it is a screen size that is 1920 pixels by 1080 pixels. So it's a defined size. 4K is then 3980 by 28 whatever it is, but it's double the size. And what that allows us to do is to zoom in to get to HD, so we can actually zoom in on video and still have crisp quality. So if something's a little further away, which happens a lot in wildlife, we can still get the guts out of it. But also, if we just use the 4K and squeeze it into a HD, the quality becomes better. So shooting in 4K definitely makes a difference. And then our shutter, our frame rate, this is effectively, so if we break video down, video is a number of photos in a row that are strung together. Think of a cartoonist drawing individual pictures and then flicking through them really fast to show the movement. It's exactly what we're doing with the video. We're taking 24 photos or 25 photos in a second and playing them back in that second, which gives us the look of reality. What new technology has allowed us to do is to shoot much faster than that. Now cameras are shooting at 60 to 90 to 120 frames in a second, allowing us to slow action down, to be able to get slow motion going. So let's watch a video. I'll talk through some of my settings and we'll look at some of the others and how it can be done on a GoPro.
My file format for movies, I like to shoot at the high speed, but what I've done is on the top menu over here, the 1, 2, and 3, I've set up differently so that I've got shortcuts to certain movie modes. So number 1 for me is aperture priority. What I've set up number 2 as is high speed 4K, and what I've set up number 3 as is an 8K video. And effectively that gives me good space, and within the movie settings then you can choose your frame rate and your bit rate. I like a faster frame rate to be able to freeze and slow down action so that I can get the slow motion effect of a lot of things.
So it's all got to do with your preference and what you want to record the stuff for. Just remember to be very methodical about what you're shooting and don't let it run for 2 hours, because it will be like looking through a tennis match later down the line. As you can see in Canon, there are, again, the 4K 60 frames, 4K 29 frames, 4K 23 frames or 24 frames, and then HD at the same thing. Often the lower your quality, the higher the frame rates can become. So you need to find the balance with what you're doing there. Here's an icon again. This is 8K movie here at 30 frames, but there is a 2K or 4K here at 120 frames. So the lower the quality goes, it moves along. The same thing with the GoPro. When we go into our video settings, we can set up different breakdowns, different shortcuts where we can choose different sizes. So the 1080 refers to our horizontal height, the 60 refers to our frame rate, and then in the GoPro, because it's a fixed lens and we're not changing things, what it does is it crops things. So the W stands for wide, so it's a wider view. Then we have SV, which is super view, which is really wide. Then we have a large, which is a bit closer, and then wide again. So there's a few different options there of different lens types to be able to get closer or really shoot wide, depending what you're doing. With wildlife, I would get to the closest one that you can zoom in a little bit more. Having it too wide, things are a little too far away. But if you're filming yourself doing some crazy stuff on a motorbike, then the super view and the wide look really, really good. So again, choose your frame rate according to the size you want. If you're wanting to slow things down later, you might want to take a little bit off and rather shoot in 2.7K, so you've got 60 frames rather than 30 frames at 4K. So you just have to look at that. And all of this can be done on the GoPro itself or in the menu that as you connect to the camera with your phone. So the reason why video has become such a big part is social media is a huge thing. And that's why I have these shortcut keys. So between my photography and the videography, there's this push in both ways. I will never lose the urge to take a photo and capture a moment and tell a story in a single frame. But there are moments that just cannot be told in a single frame, and the sound and the feeling and the movement can all be captured in a video mode. So I'll talk about how I set up those custom modes on my Sony, and you can have a look at that in a little bit, or right now. So let's jump in there.
Then we have in the fourth shooting menu, the shooting mode, and we have the recall memory setting and camera set memory. This is where I will actually set the camera up as I want to, and I will save my number 1, 2, and 3, my custom modes in those points. All I'll do is set up the camera as I need to. So like I said, my number 2 is 4K, 100 frames a second. I will set up my picture profile. I'll set up every part of that, my white balance, my shutter speeds, aperture, all of those different things. Then come to camera set memory, and I will click that and then choose where I want to save it, and Bob's your auntie, you have the right place.
So like I said, I've set my buttons up as different things. So I've actually changed the aperture priority, which was number 1 for my photography. I've taken that all the way away because I can just go to aperture priority and shoot from there. And I've set up 1 as a 25 frame 4K for interview style, normal stuff that needs to be at a specific pace. And unfortunately being schooled by one of our Nat Hab videographers, so he's trying to enlighten me as we go along. The second one is a faster 60 frame 4K, and then the last one is a ultra fast 120 frame 4K. So if something crazy is going to go off, then I'm definitely going to bump myself up to that. On Canon, the buttons are C1, C2, C3, and on Nikon, it's the U1 and U2 user settings. And effectively what you would do is you set your camera up to the settings that you want, everything. So in my case, I was setting up the video, so I would go to the video mode, and then I would leave it there on video. Then I would set up what my settings are, 4K, 30 frames, what the focus types are, what the base setting is. So the basic breakdown of video is that whatever your frame rate, so if I'm shooting at 25 frames, my shutter speed should be double that, so 50th of a second. And so it goes on. So in 120 frames, I want my shutter speed to be at least 200th of a second, 250th of a second to be able to handle that. And then once I go to my set camera recall and push that, and it will save it on those user settings. Sorry, let's jump out of there. Then our drive mode. So our drive mode is all about how fast or how many photos in a second we are taking and what we're doing with it. So let me talk you through this, and then let me play the video and we'll talk a little bit more through this.
Drive mode, our continuous speed. These are my basic settings. Low is on 5 images, mid is 10 images per second, high is 20, and high plus is 30, and all of these are found on the little ring over here. Now, for the most part, I'm shooting in mid. I like to be in this mid mode. The reason being is at 10 frames a second, I'm still capturing a huge amount of information, but I don't want to be doing 30 frames every single time because it's a 50 megapixel beast of a camera. You know, you're just going to eat up space and have too many photos to work through. If I'm waiting for a bird to get in flight, so often we have bee eaters that are flitting backwards and forwards, then I'll change to 30 frames a second. If I know a lion's going to go off on a chase or there's some action happening, I'll go to 30 frames a second. Reason being then is I have the choice between individual frames 30 of them in a second. And sometimes you can even take them, put them together, and create a little time lapse with it.
So I love that little time lapse there of the Gouveia going across. We were photographing them as the sun was setting, and because there's so many photos going off in a second, you're suddenly getting to that video length and you can string them together and create the video. But this is a vitally important thing, and a lot of people are, scared to take too many photographs. I like to choose where and when. If I know that that lion was going to run, I'm going to set it at 30 frames a second, because that means I have the ultimate choice of what position I choose the lion to be in later. But if I'm shooting a static landscape, there's no point in 30 frames a second. So you would choose a single frame. Here on the Canons, you can see the single block means one photo at a time. The high speed, H stands for high, would be a very fast shutter speed. There's high speed continuous, there's a continuous, and so we go. The little timer is our timer setting. So if I push the button, it will then take 2 seconds, 10 seconds, or a remote to be able to release those things. And each camera has a specific place to know where this goes. This doesn't change a lot. So set it once and then have a shortcut key to be able to do it. We're going to get to shortcut keys at the end, so don't stress. Here on the Nikons, much like the Sonys, they're often on a turning wheel where we can go single shot, continuous low, continuous high, and then they have a quiet function on the DSLRs. Trust me, it's no quieter. It goes click, click. It just does it slower, which I don't know how somebody thought that was quieter. Maybe if we were measuring it with decibels, it would lose 2 decibels, but it's no quieter. Don't use it. It slows your camera down. It doesn't allow you to get the photos you need when you need them. Our shutter type is very interesting, because now we're moving into a mirrorless age where our type of shutter isn't just a mechanical curtain that opens and closes. So let's have a listen and we'll move on from there.
So on menu 6 and the shutter and silent, what I like to do there is I've moved the shutter mode settings, as well as my shutter type, again to my shortcut menu. And the reason being is I like to sit and hide from time to time. We go to places like Mashatu, Zimanga, where you're in a hide situation, the animals are really close. They can be a bit skittish coming into water, and all I would do is then switch on silent mode. I don't like using it outside of that, because I like the feedback of knowing that I'm actually taking a photograph. With the anti-blackout electronic viewfinder, or EVF, it's very difficult to tell when you're taking photos if it's in silent mode. Shutter type I leave on auto, so it allows me to then go through the mechanical up to 8,000 per second, and then push it into the electronic shutter up to 32,000 per second, which gives me the ability to push and pull and move around as I need to. Now, the biggest idea that comes from this that we have to remember is that when we're doing astrophotography, you cannot go lower than, I think it's an 1/8 of a second in electronic shutter mode or in the auto mode. You have to change it to mechanical shutter so that it can open and close for those lengths of time.
So again, it's just a different way of doing things. The mechanical shutter is the literal curtain that goes in front, where electronic shutter is that there's no curtain. It just fires the cells off in what we call a rolling shutter. So they go from the top to the bottom, brrr, all the way down. And that creates the image in itself. As you can see in the new ones, you will say mechanical, electronic first curtain, and electronic in the Canons. And then in the Nikons, again, we have that electronic front curtain shutter on or off. So you just need to find where those guys are on your camera if you are shooting mirrorless. But again, watch out for this quiet. It's not much quieter. Next, we're going to go to ISO. Now, ISO is the biggest fallacy of photography, especially modern day photography, with the noise that it creates. Camera clubs have bastardized the idea of noise in your image, and it needs to be clean, but it's not really a figure. I've done a lot of different types of photography at very high ISOs with very good results, and we'll talk a little bit about it now.
Then in ISO, I like to set this up in the beginning. I manually change my ISO as I shoot. If you're into that and already doing that, it's a good thing to do because it gives you control over the noise. These new cameras can do incredible things. I've shot images at 16,000 ISO, video at 24, 32,000 ISO with very little noise. For the most part, an image is meant to be seen big and whole, like the big rhino picture behind me. If you look at that picture, the idea is that you're looking at it from a distance. We're not walking straight up to it, taking a look at it. So I set my range. I won't want it to go much higher than 32,000th of a second. And I leave my minimum shutter speed at standard, but you can alter that to fast, faster, and the different things as you need it, according to whatever your necessity is, especially if you are shooting on an auto ISO.
So the thing to remember here is different cameras have different levels. So previous cameras of mine, I wouldn't go over 6400. So then in that auto range, I would go and set that to 6400 for my range for stills. Or if it got better, then I would move along. So here's an Nikon version of it. ISO sensitivity, that's the base setting. It's on, and the maximum sensitivity that it would push to is that. Now, I still like to take control of this because I know where my camera is, and I don't want it just jumping to 51,000 if I don't need it there. If I can shoot at 200th of a second and hand hold it at 6400, I'm going to do that rather than sending it to the extremes, but it still works. The same thing goes when we're taking photos with our GoPro, is we're able to also set an ISO minimum and maximum in here because this is an auto ISO breakdown. So you won't be able to choose the specific one that you want in that unless you go to a different mode. Our white balance is a very short but very important part of photography and setting up and getting ready. So let's go through this.
White balance is quite key to a lot of images, and there's some amazing photographers that have really used white balance to their advantage and really created some incredible images using color as their means, and that white balance, that warmth, cool pinks, blues, purples, and push them around so that it creates and generates a feeling. I like to live in daylight. The reason being is to read the light as it is. I'm not letting the computer try and figure out what's white and what's not. Because I shoot in RAW, I can push and pull that after the fact quite easily.
So each brand will do it in a different way. Here we've got all of these. The names will come up at the top, but you would just scroll across on the Canon to your daylight. If it's a cloudy day, then you go here because now we've lost the sun, so it'll warm the images up. I like to try and keep mine as natural as possible. And because I shoot in RAW, the basic setup of this doesn't really make a difference because I can change it all without any problem when I get to the post-production. I can choose any value and the image is not broken. It's not affected in any way by the change. Nikon just have a different looking list, and depending on which camera you have, you will be able to choose one of those. And you can even do that sort of white balance inside your GoPro. So have a look at your GoPros and change that to not just be auto. The reason why auto can struggle, especially if you come on a guerrillas trip with us, if there's intense greens, what the white balance tends to do is look at this and go, whoa, there's too many greens, and push it to the magenta side. So everything looks a little purple on the darks. Or you're taking a beautiful sunset as a wonderful orange and beautiful warm colors, and the camera looks at this and goes, this is very orange, I need to go to the cooler side, to the blue side to balance it. So auto is not always the best place to be. Try to take control of that camera and what it's used for. Our focus setup is vitally important. So I've left this towards the end so that it sinks in a bit longer, and I'm going to let you watch this and we'll talk through this.
Now we get to focus. And focus is a massive part of what we're doing, and the power within this body all sits within the focus functions. So when I go in here, I have set my priority set. So when the camera actually takes the correct reading for AFS, which is static or single point, I use that at autofocus, at the point of focus. In AFC, when continuous autofocus, which I live in all the time, my camera lives in AFC because of the fact that I can then push and pull different things. I choose that the focus is correct at release. So the camera is now trying to make sure that when I'm releasing the shutter, that the thing is in focus. The tracking sensitivity, I have taken away from standard to 2, so locked on. I don't want it all the way locked on, but I wanted to hold on to my subject as best I can because I use the tracking function in the focus and autofocus most of the time. And it is so powerful. It's given me the option to be able to be more creative. And I choose to do back button focus. So I have turned AF with shutter off. That basically means that the shutter now cannot autofocus. The AF on button at the back here is the button that I will use to autofocus. This allows me to be able to focus and release and take photos. So it is like me shooting in AFS. When I remove my finger and when something is moving, I continually hold it in to be able to track that option. I'm almost at the point of wondering if it's greatly necessary with these cameras because the tracking is so accurate and so good that very often I don't need to recompose or have to take my finger off to do that. But it helps with other things like my astrophotography. I can focus, let go, and not worry about it trying to refocus in between each shot. I can just push the shutter and carry on.
So that's a very important part of this whole thing is what we're shooting with is the AFC, or in our Canons, it's AI servo. It is our continuous autofocus. We want the camera to continually read how far the subject is. If we have it in AFS, which means single point or static, it will read it once and not again. So you can take 100 photos and it will still have measured the distance only once, which becomes a problem. Because if the lion or the leopard or the bird moves to the next branch, it's now closer or further away from you, it's out of focus. So by focusing in AFC, that allows us to track and capture these things. And the cameras are amazing. I mean, my A1 refocuses 120 times every second. So you can imagine how powerful that is in the greater scheme of things. So again, it's about choosing the right focus mode. What is our thing? This here would be showing that it's face and tracking, so it's looking for smiles. And so each camera has its best ways of doing it. Now the last bit, and we just have about enough time for it, is our custom buttons.
Now the strongest part and the biggest part of what helped me transition to using a new body to the Sonys was the customization of all of the keys. That every single button on basically on the camera, barring the shutter button, can be changed to a different function. So I'm going to run through a couple of my custom key settings so that you can see what's going on. So effectively, my rear wheel, I have changed to exposure compensation, allowing me to go add light and remove light just by rolling that while looking through my EVF. I have number 2, the AEL button over here, as my registered AF area and AF on, so that if I wish to go to tracking of birds in a zonal form, I will push that. Number 3, the AF on button, I will use as my focus. Obviously, number 4 is where the little red dot is, and that is my record button. 5, up on the top right here, is my white balance, and then I put number 4 down at the bottom here, my focus area. And it's amazing how these buttons here, especially that focus area button, I use quite a lot, because with the EVF, as I push it, I get the menu coming up in my eye, which allows me then to change whatever I need to. If a subject is stuck behind a bush, or the tracking is faltering because there's moving grass in front of things, I can change to a small spot, to different things, so that I can quickly access those areas and move through them. My focus standard, and I've left my ISO as the ISO button, which is on the back here, just on the edge of the reel. If I push right, I get my ISO and I get to change that. So my exposure values on the wheel and ISO is on the wheel, so that helps me a lot. Number C1, I have put on as my face eye subject select, so I can choose who is who. And then I have used C2 over here as my APS-C Super 35 zoom in, so it gives me a crop factor should I need it. I use it sometimes with video. For the most part, I don't use it with photos, because I can zoom in while I'm on the computer, or full frame, so I can switch between those two as I need to. Effectively, I want to get the basics set up so that when we're out there, there's very little to do, and there's certain things that I would have moved across to my shortcut menu so that I can go through and find the things very easily. Shortcut menu is here by the star, and you can see I've got 2 menus, my menu 1 and my menu 2. And this allows me to not have to go through the entire menu, which is quite comprehensive on the A1. Fortunately, they've changed the menu system up for the A1 and the A7 and S3, and it's made a huge difference logically, but still there's a lot to go through. So what we want to do is set it up correctly the first time, so that when we go back to this, we don't have to go through all of it. So the menu systems are going to work really well. How I would add things to the menu system is to go to my menu setting, add item, and then you would go through the list of things that you already have and find the things that we are looking for. So the format function I have put in my shortcut menu. It's the first thing I do, because every time I put a card back in and I've dumped the card, I will format it so that it's clear, because when you format a card, it brings it back to the native language of the camera in choice, or that you're using. Now, if you're moving from one camera to another, what can often happen is they speak different languages, which means that you might get a corruption in the card. So format moves straight into my different pieces.
So this is just a look at my different formats and the things that I've added to my menus myself. So that's my presentation.
So I hope that now it's about learning what your camera can do in different situations to capture the images that will show off the incredible places that you visit, to show off the magical things you get to see while you're out there, and to capture your audience in a beautiful way.
Why don't you want, because we're at the end. So that's my presentation for today. Rob, are there any questions?
Yes, Richard. Now, before we start the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. So can you share your thoughts for us on crop mode on full frame mirrorless?
So they have their space in everything. The crop sensors, your sensor is effectively smaller than a full frame sensor. So your light sensors are smaller and the amount of detail they can record and light they can record is limited. But it saves you money on lenses because a crop factor means that my 400mm lens turns into a effective almost 600mm lens, where to buy a 600mm lens is very expensive. So you have to play the trade-off between the two. I love full frame. It doesn't mean that I wouldn't shoot with a crop factor. I mean, like the Nikon D500 is probably one of the best crop sensors ever created. And you've just got to figure out what your necessity is. But as you move through photography, you're going to hit a wall where you would have to move from your crop sensor through to your full frame should you want different results and better results.
So tell us a little bit about how you handle weather with your camera. How do you protect it from the rain and any other tricks you might be able to share with us?
So again, this comes down to what type of camera you have. The more expensive they are, the better weather sealed they are. I have taken the Sonys into some pretty crazy rainstorms in the Gorillas, and you're obviously trying to cover it up with camera sleeves, which you can get from B&H or any of your camera stores, which would definitely help protect. The other thing is a bag, the correct type of bag to be able to carry it in that's got waterproofing. I use a Peak Design travel bag, but there's a couple of everyday photo bags and things from Peak Design that are amazing. They're all made out of weatherproof material, weatherproof zips, so that you don't have the water leaking in when you're walking or even in a vehicle. And then just trying to cover up as best as possible. You, as much as they might say it's weather sealed, you don't want to take the chance. And if you are planning on going to somewhere that could downpour on your camera, insurance is always a very good thing to have.
Good point. Thank you for that. So for a camera without an interchangeable lens, what do you think how do you think about the trade-off between, say, sensor size and optical zoom? For example, if you had a 2/3 sensor with a 20 times zoom versus a smaller sensor with a higher zoom?
So the higher the zoom, the more you are going to struggle. You would rather have, or personally, I would rather have a bigger sensor with bigger megapixels and less reach. That would allow me to crop later and use those images still with a far more steady and better quality of image. Sometimes these zooms go to like 900 times and it's just crazy. Yes, you can see the tick on the lion's tip of its tail from 500 yards away, but you try hold that camera still in order to get that perfect. It's more of a measuring game like boys do rather than a functional use. So you have to find the perfect balance, and bridge cameras are amazing. And you don't need interchangeable lenses. I've shot with the Sony RX10 Mark IV. It is one of my favorite cameras just because it's small, it's compact, and the image quality is absolutely through the roof. And it's got an effective zoom of 600 mils. So the sensor is working to its strengths. It's been built with that sensor in mind to be a 600 f4. Just beware of too much zoom and causing too much shake and vibration. Better cameras are higher megapixels with your ability to hold it steady.
So on the Sony RX10, would you set it to automatic focus or would you do continuous?
I would always set it to an autofocus, but it must be in continuous autofocus, AFC. But autofocus, manual focus is only for macro photography and really tough situations and astrophotography. The rest of the time you should be shooting in an autofocus. And for any wildlife, you need to be in AFC or AI servo on a Canon, is autofocus continuous. It is mandatory. And then choose your area based on what you're doing. If it's small items where you have to shoot between branches, then you go for a small spot. If it's birds flying, then you go wider so that it can pick up those contrast against the sky.
So let me ask you this. When is the best time to use a tripod?
Whenever you can, but that's not always the easiest thing to do. The rule of thumb is that whatever your length of your lens is, so let's go to the extreme of 600 millimeters, you should be at least that in shutter speed, so 600th of a second, or double that in order to cancel out any camera shake. Then you really don't need a tripod. But if you have a tripod, you're going to get still a better opportunity at getting a solid frame. The other part is astrophotography would require one, and landscape photography would require one. So you have to figure out where you're going with these things. There are some incredible, again, lightweight, good for travel, good for Nat Hab, packing restrictions, stuff that only weighs about 2 or 3 pounds. You can leave 2 pairs of underwear behind, you'll be sharp, no one's going to know, and we move on from there. But Peak Design makes an incredible tripod too for that.
Now, would you always have your lens set up on the image stabilization mode, or would you turn that off on a tripod?
Great question. I would, on the tripod, generally turn it off because it's looking for movement. If there's no movement, sometimes it can fool the camera into thinking, oh wait, there's no movement. There must be movement. It can't not be movement. And then it causes problems. So I'd switch it off on a tripod, but I haven't experienced too much difficulty with that.
So can you explain a little bit more about how you edit on your phone? What program you use, perhaps?
With pleasure. So I use the same program as I do on my computer. It's called Lightroom. The mobile version is called Lightroom Mobile. It's a free application that you can download. And if you have the computer software that you have a subscription to, you get 2 or 3 extra functions, which are quite handy to be able to use on that. And literally, I'll send from my Sony camera, find my phone, send it to this, the raw photo will come on, and just with the sliders, I'm able to change up that image and make it look just before I send it out.
Richard, thank you for taking the questions, but unfortunately, that's the last one we have time for today. So I'd like to turn it back to you for any closing comments you may have.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you, Nat Hab, for hosting these amazing events. And I really hope that you get a fire in your belly to get this all going. On all of our photo departures and pro photo departures, we're going to concentrate on trying to get your cameras done. So ask your expedition leaders, they'll be able to help you go along. And if anyone has any questions, you're more than welcome to send them through Nat Hab or contact me through my social media channels. I'd be happy to take those. Thank you, Nat Hab. Thank you to all of you.
Richard, thank you for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Now, if you're interested in information on how you can travel with Nat Hab, give us a call at the number on your screen or send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars, or send us an email at webinars@nathab.com, and we can direct you to the correct page. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.